Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, in our series about the great political fictions, I'm talking about another big Victorian novel. This one, unlike Middlemarch, is definitely about politics. It's part of Anthony Trollope's great sequence of political novels, the Palliser novels. It's about high politics, parliamentary politics, prime ministerial politics, but above all, it's about the truth-tellers and the hypocrites. The book I'm talking about today, Phineas Redux by Anthony Trollope, which was published in 1874, is a great political novel, but I don't think it's a great novel. In fact, I'm not even sure I'd want to argue it's a very good novel. It's the second of the two Phineas Finn books. The first one, named Phineas Finn, was published 5 years earlier, and it's the fourth book in Trollope's sequence that's known as the Palliser novels, 6 novels about high politics in the Victorian era, the 1860s, the 1870s, parliamentary politics, prime ministerial politics. The two Phineas Finn books are probably the two best books in that sequence, but they do share the characteristics of those books as a whole, which is they are a bit melodramatic, a bit schematic, a little formulaic. The characters in them never really behave out of character. They are a little, if not one-dimensional, maybe two-dimensional. Sometimes it feels a bit clockwork. Nothing that surprising ever happens, though a lot of high drama happens in these books. There are also quite a few stock characters. One of Trollope's vices, and you definitely get it in this book, is he has a weakness for the stock Jewish character, the Jew. So there is in this book a character who is sometimes referred to as the Jew, and he is a criminal, a bigamist, an adulterer, a pretend Christian, and ultimately a murderer. There is a murder in this book. I don't want to call it a murder mystery because Trollope says, the narrator says up front, there's no surprise here about who did it. One of the characters at one point in the book says, surely the Jew did it. And I'm afraid it turns out the Jew did it. Having said all that, it's also a comforting read, and Trollope's always had many, many fans who read his books for comfort, including politicians. Many politicians love Trollope's political novels, partly because no one ever behaves that much out of character. And there is something comforting about the predictability of these books. They do work like clockwork, and they're satisfying in the way that a novel where lots of different intricate parts are fitted together neatly, clearly, entertainingly. Those books often are very comforting. And Trollope's fans have included all sorts of people, including George Eliot, who is said to have been partly inspired to write Middlemarch by having read Trollope's other great sequence, the Barchester Chronicles, a story of provincial life and clerical life, in which Trollope inspired Eliot to believe it was possible to portray the life of a community, quite a large community, with all of its intricate moving parts in the round, to see how it all fitted together. That's Trollope's genius. The difference between Trollope and George Eliot is that with Trollope, you never really see through the characters in either sense. That is, you don't see into them. You don't see inside them into the inner recesses of their thinking, of their souls, of their consciences. And you also don't really see through them in the sense of seeing the world through their eyes, so that you get, which you get miraculously with George Eliot, that sense that sometimes you're actually inhabiting another human being. Well, I've certainly never got that reading Trollope. You always bump up against the surface of these characters. You're seeing them always from the outside, and they fit together neatly, interestingly. Amazing things happen to these characters. Weird, bizarre things happen to these characters. But never in this book do you ever get the sense that you're going beyond what's happening on the surface. And that's why it works as a great political fiction. Because this is a book, Phineas Redux, about parliamentary politics in the high Victorian era, but it's also, in a timeless way, about parliamentary politics, a world in which there are a lot of stock characters, in which reality is played out on the surface of things. Politicians are not encouraged, sometimes even allowed, to behave out of character. Your character is in many ways who you are. and the world of politics works by trying to work out how people who are fixed in particular roles then interact with each other, knowing the constraints of their roles. So it is in part a world, and this is what Trollope's book is about, where hidden depths are frowned on. You're not meant to have a conscience. If you start parading your soul, it looks like a parade. It looks like a charade. In parliamentary politics of this period, and maybe of any period, the job of the politician is to act out. It is to play a part. And Trollope is brilliant at playing with that in this book, so that the kind of writing that he does, in which characters do behave according to character, actually weirdly feels like it's an authentic account of a particular world. It's the truth about that world. And then it also raises all sorts of questions for these characters, which are the key questions in this book. What do you do in a world where you are not allowed to have hidden depths, or you're not meant to have hidden depths, where the character that you've committed yourself to is who you are? And so to deviate from that character may not actually take you closer to the truth. It may take you further away from the thing that you're trying to achieve, which in many cases in this book, both in the public realm and in the private realm, is a form of power. Power is a kind of truth in this book. And it is a book full of melodrama because politics is full of melodrama. That is one of the things that parliamentary politics specializes in, the melodramatic occasion, the melodramatic issue on which questions of character are taken to turn, not because people are going to reveal who they really are, but because you're going to get to see how certain kinds of characters play out in very stylized, very melodramatic conditions, where actually the room for maneuver is constrained. And within that narrow set of constraints, people have to decide what they want to do, given who they have told the world that they are. And in Phineas Redux, there are two great melodramas, one of which happens at the prime ministerial level, and the other of which happens further down the greasy pole. The second of them relates to the central character, Phineas Finn. He's a backbench MP, and it's a melodrama involving not just politics, but his personal circumstances. But that one plays out against the backdrop of the grander prime ministerial melodrama. So I'll talk about that one first. The prime ministerial story in this book is clearly a very, very lightly concealed version of the politics of the time, because it's about the two dominant political figures of the age. So this is the early mid-1870s, when British politics was dominated by the leaders of the two main parties, William Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, the Conservative Prime Minister. And this is the era where they took it in turns in and out of office of power, turn and turn about. In this book, and the attempt to conceal them is minimal, Mr. Gladstone is called Mr. Gresham, the leader of the Liberal Party in the Phineas Finn world of Victorian parliamentary politics. The leader of the Conservative Party is called Mr. Daubeny. Trollope just about managed to resist the temptation to play on Disraeli's Jewish roots. Nonetheless, Daubeny is Disraeli, Gresham is Gladstone. And they are characterized in terms which make them familiar then and now to anyone who knew the real political figures. So Mr. Gresham is a principled politician, a politician of high principle, the Liberal leader. He prides himself on his ability to present political issues in terms that bring out the fundamental hidden truths at stake. He is a highly intellectual politician. He gives long, passionate, but also tightly argued speeches in which he lays out all sides of a question and arrives at a position trying to take his audience with him by force of intellect as well as of personality. He is deeply impressive and he commands the Commons by force of intellect and personality. But he is also unloved, partly because he is such a powerful presence, but also because he is someone so clearly who makes stands on principles, and it's a little alienating for his followers. He is very demanding of his followers. He has reached the top of the greasy pole by being, in his way, the most principled politician of the age. But everyone knows that you don't get to the top of the greasy pole just by being principled. You have to compromise, you have to cut corners, you have to go back on your own principles. Everyone knows that about Mr. Gresham. Mr. Gladstone. Everyone knows, essentially, he's not quite as good as he presents himself as, but that is his persona, and that is the role that he is committed to playing. Mr. Disraeli is not his opposite, but he is his mirror. He is not a politician of principle. He is known in many ways as being unprincipled, in the sense that you never quite know what it is that he stands for. He's the conservative, and yet in some ways he is the flightier politician. He is the more erratic politician. Trollope describes him at one point in this book as a magician or a conjurer. He's the kind of politician who pulls tricks out of the air. Mr. Gresham always lets you see his workings. Mr. Daubeny sometimes does things and you think, how the hell did he just do that? And how the hell does he think he's going to get away with that? And he commands his party and he commands the Commons, partly by a kind of showmanship, but also because he delivers results. So just as everyone knows that Mr. Gresham is not quite as principled as he would like the world to believe that he is, everyone knows that Mr. Daubeny is a pragmatist as well as being a conjurer. And part of the point of the conjuring tricks is to magic up the thing that they're all interested in, which is office and power. And when this book starts, Daubeny, not Gresham, is in power. Disraeli is prime minister. But there's been a general election, happens early on in the book, and Daubeny is at the head of a government that can't command a majority in the House of Commons. And the election has made this worse. There are more Liberals. But this isn't an age where elections just decide things. It's not the case that whoever wins the election gets a chance to try and form a government. Daubeny is in post, he is in office, and unless he loses votes in the Commons, he has an unspoken right to try and remain there and to see if he can construct a majority out of the different membership of the Commons that's arrived after this election. He knows he can't do it simply on the basis of party loyalty. So he's got to try and find an issue that might somehow interfere with the logic of this party division, bring some people over from the other side, discombobulate the calculus, the arithmetic of parliamentary politics. And so he does it by plucking an issue out of the air. And the issue that he picks on, it sounds pretty dry, but Trollope conveys that actually when he does this, it conveys horror and shock, not just in Parliament, but across the country. The issue he picks on is the disestablishment of the Church of England. That is, he lets it be known that at the head of a conservative administration, he would like to push forward the ending of the Anglican Church as the state religion of Great Britain. And the reason this is so shocking is that the Conservative Party is the party of the Anglican Church. The Conservative Party is the party of the establishment. The Conservative Party is the party of the monarchy, and the monarch is the head of the state religion. And here you have a Conservative politician, a Conservative Prime Minister, in order to stay in power, saying that he will put forward a proposition which is the antithesis of what he and his party are meant to stand for. It's shocking. It looks like rank hypocrisy. How can you be a Tory in favour of disestablishment? But, as Trollope says, referring both to the world of fiction and to the real world of British politics, the Conservative Party in general, and Disraeli/Daubeny in particular, have form here. This wouldn't be the first time that the Conservative Party, to stay in office, has done the seemingly most unconservative things. It happened earlier in the Victorian era when the Conservative Party ended up repealing the Corn Laws and embracing free trade, a party that had staked its claim to be the party that defended the established order, which back then meant defending the Corn Laws, ditched them. And in ditching them, showed itself not to be a party of principle, but a party, to put it politely, of pragmatism, to put it less politely, of rank hypocrisy. And then it happened again more recently when Disraeli was Prime Minister in 1867-68, with the passing of the Second Reform Act, so the other great issue of the age in terms of reform, which was reform of the voting system, widening the franchise to allow, at this point, working men to vote. The Conservative Party, in theory, the defender of the established order, established hierarchy, suddenly embraces a more radical version of reform than Gladstone's Liberal Party. It outflanks Gladstone on the question that the Liberals are meant to own. It steals the other side's clothes. And Disraeli sells to his party the thing that they're not meant to believe in, which is radical reform, by saying, if we do it, we will own it. And if we own it, one, we will get the reward for it from the voters. Working men will vote Conservative. And second, we will stop them doing it in a way which will be destructive of the Constitution. What matters is not so much what's being done. What matters is who's doing it. If Conservatives do it, we can control the negative effects. If we let them do it, we've lost control. It's a version of that Conservative argument that says if things are going to remain the same, things have to change. And if things have to change, it's better that Conservatives are the ones who change them. But Trollope is aware that in suggesting, which never happened and still hasn't happened, I don't know what Trollope would think if he knew that I could be speaking 150 years later and the Church of England still hasn't been disestablished. It is still, nominally at least, the state religion. In doing this through that issue, Trollope knows he's going even further. Indeed, there are characters in the book who say things like, we know Daubeny is capable of anything, but seriously? The disestablishment of the church from a Tory, from a Conservative Prime Minister? Is he now going to come along and say he's also proposing that we abolish the monarchy and establish a republic? Are there no limits to the things that this man will renege on for the sake of keeping the right people in power? It's not quite a satire, but it's a heightened version of what's going on. Disestablishment is clearly a step too far. And yet, what happens in the book anyway, is that the Conservative Party goes along with him. Daubeny floats the idea and people are horrified. And then he floats it again and they're a little bit reconciled to it. And then he makes some speeches in the Commons in which he explains that this is actually a very pragmatic measure. And what he's suggesting is merely trying to allow Conservatives to take charge of what is probably coming inevitably, and it would be much better if Conservatives were able to manage the consequences of this act, because if Conservatives aren't in charge, anything might happen. And his party listens to him, and they know it's an act. They know it's a conjuring trick, and yet they also believe it's their job as a party to hold together. It might work. It conceivably could keep them in power. And then the other thing that it's clearly designed to do, which they don't just reconcile themselves to, but they enjoy, it sends the other side mad. Because the effect of what Daubeny does is to put Gresham on the spot, because he has stolen the other side's clothes. If the reform of the Church of England was going to come, the assumption was it would surely come from the reforming side of politics. That's the Liberals here. Reformers, and some of them radicals. Some of them have been openly advocating for the disestablishment of the church. And now the Conservatives are putting it forward. So what is Gresham meant to do? And he's got a real dilemma, which is he can't vote for this measure when the Conservatives put it forward. He can't keep this man in office, this unreliable, untrustworthy charlatan in office, simply because he is now advocating the thing that Gresham's side might well have been advocating. But on the other hand, if he votes against it, if he says, we oppose now this government and its plans, what are his reasons? Because he can't do it on principled grounds. He can't construct one of his magnificent 3-hour speeches explaining why the disestablishment of the Church of England has suddenly become a bad idea. The only way he can justify it is by saying, well, they shouldn't be allowed to do it because they're not trustworthy. And that makes him a hypocrite. Because the other thing that Mr. Gresham is known to stand for, and indeed the liberal side of politics is known to stand for, is in a phrase that Trollope uses a lot in this novel, measures not men. That is, the reforming side of politics think the problem with the Tories, with the Conservatives, is they're all about personality politics. They're all about personalities, not issues, which is what Tony Benn, another radical reforming politician of a later generation, always used to say. Why is politics about the personalities and not the issues? That's the reforming view. We're above personality politics. We actually look at the merits of the case and we decide what to do on the basis of what makes sense, of what adds up. We do the maths. We look at the evidence. That's what the reformers always say. And now they're being forced to say, well, the evidence probably suggests that disestablishment is a good idea, but we're still against it. And the reason we're against it is we don't like those people doing it. And it kind of drives Gresham mad because he has to make that case. He knows he has to make that case. If he's going to hold his party together, he has to get the other side out of power because power is what this is about. But he's got to make the case in terms that he knows are hypocritical. And it infuriates him He ties himself up in knots. He has sleepless nights because he hates being forced to act, as he thinks of it, out of character and be the unprincipled personality politician, even though in his heart of hearts, he also knows, as a politician, that's what they all are. I first read this book maybe 25 years ago, and then I reread it very recently to talk about it now. And rereading it, I was struck by how even more contemporary it feels, because in that intervening period, British politics has gone through a version of this, a kind of Trollope moment in its recent history, which was the parliament that sat after the Brexit referendum. The parliament when Theresa May was Prime Minister, but then particularly in 2019, when Theresa May fell and Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. High parliamentary politics. There wasn't a general election in that period. Politics was dominated by politicians of all sides trying to assemble majorities in the Commons for their particular positions, having to jockey and chop and change while still trying to claim they were the politicians of principle. But above all, the resonance is that Boris Johnson is Daubeny, or rather, Daubeny reads like Boris Johnson, not Disraeli. So Boris Johnson, I think, sometimes wanted to portray himself as a modern-day Disraeli. He's not. He wasn't. He isn't. But also, he's not a pocketbook Disraeli. He's a Trollope Disraeli. He's like this fictional character, this cartoonish version, this slightly ridiculous version, the conjurer, the magician, who sometimes manages to pull power out of thin air and keep himself in power, keep the balls in the air until the conjuring trick falls apart. And for Daubeny, as for Johnson, one of Trollope's lessons here is you can't keep the balls in the air forever. Conjurers always come unstuck. There comes a point where people see that the magic isn't working, or more to the point, they notice that it's just a trick. And then they lose all faith. It happened to Johnson in this book. It happens to Daubeny. He can't keep it going. In the end, Gresham wins. Gresham has the politics. He has the majority. In the end, he's able to be more in character, even though he's forced to do the thing that's hypocritical. He drives his party behind him, and he resumes power. But there are two bits in particular where this book really reminded me of that Brexit period. One is the complaint that was always made against Johnson. It comes up all the time, is that this great issue, Brexit, was decided partly by Johnson on completely whimsical grounds. People often mention that before the referendum, Boris Johnson wrote 2 articles for the Daily Telegraph, one in which he would make the case for leaving the European Union, one in which he would make the case for staying in the European Union. And then he picked one over the other, leave, not stay, and that was then his career. And it made him Prime Minister in the end. And it feels grotesque that the fate of a nation could hang on a journalist flipping a coin between 2 columns that he's written overnight for his daily newspaper. In Phineas Redux, Gresham floats the idea of disestablishing the Church of England almost on a whim. In a speech he makes in his constituency, it's clear he hasn't consulted anyone. He's just trying it out. He's feeling it out, seeing what he can get away with, seeing what he can construct on the back of this. And the fate of the nation hangs on it. That's politics. And then there was that period in the autumn of 2019 when Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament. And the outrage it provoked was partly because he was doing it as a Conservative politician. And then and now, the Conservative Party ostensibly is meant to stand for the established order or the Constitution or the Crown, being respectful to the Queen. And here was Boris Johnson, and his enemies screamed this in his face, disrespecting the Queen, even though that made them hypocrites, because many of them aren't remotely interested in respecting the monarchy. But they couldn't bear the idea that a so-called Conservative politician was just ripping up the Constitution, behaving in a way that was anarchic, like he was a radical. And Johnson, like Daubeny in this book, understood that the effectiveness of that form of politics is precisely that it drives the other side, the opposition, mad. Johnson's goal in 2019 was to so goad the other side that in their frustration and their rage and their inability to exercise pragmatic political judgment, they would allow him to have a general election. And that finished them off until he finished himself off by failing to be able to keep all the magic balls in the air. But he got his way by goading them, and he goaded them by driving them mad with his hypocrisy. In Phineas Redux, Trollope describes various great parliamentary set-tos in which Daubeny's skill is the more angry the other side get, the calmer he becomes. And Johnson was the same in 2019. Johnson was amazingly disciplined in his first months as Prime Minister because he had been persuaded by Dominic Cummings that this strategy would work if his opponents could be enraged, and then even more enraged by his inability to recognise that they were entitled to be enraged. And in Parliament, Johnson would stand there and let them scream at him. And in this book, Daubeny allows the other side to rant and rave, and he just smiles. He just looks at them, and it's a look that drives them mad because it tells them they can't help acting in the way that is serving his purposes. The other thing that Trollope says, which feels very contemporary, is that part of the passion in this drama, indeed part of what makes it so melodramatic, is that the two sides actually aren't that far apart. One of the reasons that they're able to steal each other's clothes is that the principles on which they're operating have coalesced around a sort of middle ground of politics. The most radical options, even the disestablishment of the church, aren't that radical. Revolution is not on the cards. The actual overturning of the established order is what neither side wants. And Trollope says, in some versions of politics where it really is revolutionary, actually, the stakes are so high that people are able to behave quite well because they know that there are more important things than the personalities involved. But in this kind of politics, it becomes all about personalities because if you tried to make it about principle, you wouldn't actually be able to hold the two parties together. There are enough people on either side who could possibly be on the other side that you've got to hold it together with the force of the personality of the leaders. He's not saying, as people sometimes say of academic life, that it's not actually a fight about anything. The joke about academics, why do they behave so badly to each other? Because the stakes are so low. Trollope doesn't believe the stakes are low here. In some ways, they couldn't be higher. This is Parliament at the height of the power of the British Empire. At one point in this book, Trollope says, this Parliament, this small group of men, they were all men then, are ruling India, a nation of hundreds of millions of people, and decisions that are taken in this building by the Thames affect the lives of people all over the globe. It couldn't be more consequential. But when there's a debate in the Commons because the Colonial Office is moving a question of reform of the governance of India, i.e., as he says, something that really matters, whatever you think about the empire, it matters what decision is taken in Westminster about the lives of hundreds of millions of Indians. No one comes to those debates because no one's interested. Because actually, it's a kind of technocratic question. It doesn't divide them. But if people in the Commons know that one politician is going to try and take down another one, they'll all show up, and they'll all show up for the show. In one of the debates that's described in Phineas Redux, when Daubeny realizes that the game is up and he's going to have to hand over power to Mr. Gresham, he gives a speech that Trollope describes as weird and mystical and confusing to his followers, neither principled nor really anything. He almost goes into a kind of trance, and they start to wonder, what is all this about? But then they realize what this is about is he's having to admit defeat. And he sits down, and Gresham has been so desperate to resume the position he thinks he is owed, which is where he can dominate the Commons, be in charge, lay out the principal case. Now he can take over these very monumental, momentous questions, and he can manage them on principled and reformist grounds. And he's full of a 3-hour speech that's bursting to get out of him. And so Daubeny concedes, and Gresham gets up. But it's a trick. It's a petty parliamentary trick. Daubeny has sat down, but then he leaps to his feet again, and he says, I've got one more thing I have to say, forcing Gresham, who has stood up, to sit down. That's all it is. One man sits down, another man stands up, but the man who stood up is forced to sit down again because the first man has played a trick on him, has sat down in a fake way. There's no principle involved here. There's no politics involved here. It's just a show. And it's the unforgivable thing. It is the thing that Gresham will never forgive him for. Gresham will never forgive Daubeny for sitting down and not meaning it, and forcing him to sit down when he was ready to lay out his principal case. And while all this is going on, there's the other story in this book, which is the story of Phineas Finn. So a bit of background here. Phineas Finn is a youngish man. He's from Ireland. He's a Catholic. In the first book, the Phineas Finn novel, he becomes an MP and he becomes a minister. This is an age where backbench MPs aren't paid. So if you have no money, and Phineas Finn has no money, you need ministerial office in order to live in London in any kind of life to which a politician might grow accustomed. He takes ministerial office in the first book, but he has to give it up because he votes on principle, on conscience, against his government, his Liberal government. He's a Liberal, I should say. And he has to go back to Ireland, effectively admitting defeat. He couldn't reconcile his conscience with parliamentary life, even though actually the issue on which he voted against the government come round to his position. He was just a little ahead of his time. In the second book, he comes back. He's gone to Ireland. He's got married. His young wife has died. He's now looking for something to do, and he's tempted back into parliamentary life because the implication is once you've got that drug in your veins, there is actually nothing more exciting than being an MP in the House of Commons at the height of its power, to be part of these debates, to be part of that game. And he's addicted to it. He wants another go. And so he is persuaded to stand for election again. This time he stands in a northern constituency called Tankerville. And this is the age of reform. So this is a period where parliamentary politics is shifting to a basis where there are no rotten boroughs, at least they're not meant to be, where elections should be relatively honest or transparent. Votes are not meant to be bought. The corruption that was rife in British politics is in the process of being rooted out. And there are legal remedies if you feel your opponent has stolen the election from you. So quite deliberately, Finn is told, go and stand in this seat. You'll probably lose, but you'll lose because the Tory always buys the vote. And he'll buy the vote again this time because he has no other idea about how to win. He actually has no idea about politics. He just buys votes. But this time, there are laws that say buying votes is not on. And so once you've lost, you can then take him to court and you can relitigate the election. And actually, you can get a recount where some of his votes will be disqualified. And if you can get enough of his votes disqualified, that's the way you'll become an MP. So you won't win what you might say fair and square, because it won't be fair and square. It'll be corrupt. And it's the corruption that will allow you in, which is interesting in a contemporary context, given we now live in an age where that's the one thing you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed after the election to relitigate it and say, I want to disqualify these votes. I want to take this to court. I want to say that the election wasn't fair. I want a new result. I want a new set of figures that work for me. If you do that, you're told you're not a Democrat. In this period, that was actually the side of democracy. Rooting out corruption meant being willing to fight and lose and go to court and win. And that's what Phineas Finn does. And this is partly wish fulfillment on the part of Trollope, because Trollope also had wanted to be an MP. He was a Liberal, and he fought a northern constituency, and he fought a corrupt northern constituency where he knew he would lose, and he did lose, and he lost because the vote was bought, and it was taken to court. But unfortunately for Trollope, in his case, the corruption was sufficient that the constituency was abolished. In Phineas Finn's case, he's given the election, and he takes his seat in the House of Commons, and he's back. In that election, he has to stand for something. So even though he knows he's not going to win on merit because the election will be stolen from him, and so he's going to have to relitigate it, he can't just show up and twiddle his thumbs and say, I'm here waiting for my opponent to be corrupt so I can win the seat. He has to have a platform. He has to stand for something. And one of the questions he has to decide is, well, he's an Irish Catholic, so what should he say about the Church of England? And on the one hand, he thinks, well, because I'm an Irish Catholic, I better not frighten the horses by talking about disestablishment. But his agent persuades him that actually he might as well embrace the cause of reform, because he's an Irish Catholic. If he said anything else, it wouldn't be that convincing. He's not going to be a convincing upholder of the Anglican establishment. So he might as well follow his broad outline of political character, which is Irish Catholic in favour of reform. At least it would have the merit of being sincere, because as an Irish Catholic, he is actually in favour of reform. So if in doubt, why not do the sincere thing? So he gets elected having stood on a reform/disestablishment platform. Then he arrives in the Commons and discovers that the Tories, the Conservatives, are now embracing disestablishment. So now what's he meant to do? So he's got a version of Gresham's dilemma. If he votes for what the Conservative government are advocating, he will keep them in power, even though it's the thing he got elected to uphold. But if he votes against the government, he's also going to be voting against the thing that he told his constituents they were electing him to Parliament to achieve. So he can't win. But for him, unlike for Gresham, it's not really a dilemma at all. He's learned his lesson. He got burnt last time by voting with his conscience. He has no problem this time saying, it's okay. I know I said that in the election campaign, but now the Tories are saying it. I'm not for it. And the reason I'm not for it is straightforwardly because they are not to be trusted to do it. He has got no compunction about saying, if you want the disestablishment of the Church of England, for God's sake, don't let the Tories do it. Wait for us. So we'll get them out of office. And then when they're out of office, you can trust us to do the thing that we said we would do. And in the meantime, yes, we'll have to vote against our so-called conscience. Not a problem. And part of the reason it's not a problem for Phineas Finn is that, once again, he's penniless and he needs ministerial office. So he's got to serve his party, he's got to serve his government. And he knows the way to establish yourself as a reliable politician is to show that you're willing to vote not with your principles, but against them. That's what all political leaders want. They want politicians who are sufficiently pragmatic that they will do the right thing by the party. And so Phineas Finn is clear he has to send that signal to Gresham to get ministerial office. His problem is by now he's got a mortal enemy. There's another figure in the party, a man called Mr. Bonteen, who's a dry, technocratic, irritating politician. He has no obvious principles. He is power crazed. The issue that he builds his political career on is decimalization, not disestablishment. So his job has been in politics. He's a finance politician to work out how to turn shillings and farthings into a currency that can be divisible by 10. It's a kind of parody. It took 100 years to happen. Again, I think Trollope would be surprised that it was another 100 years before decimalization actually happened. But in 1870, to be for decimalization was to be a dry as dust politician. Mr. Bonteen is all about decimalization and he's all about power. And he hates Phineas Finn. He hates him because he's good looking, he's glamorous, he's popular. He seems to keep getting away with it. And he persuades Gresham not to give him a ministerial post on the grounds that he's not to be trusted. Why is he not to be trusted? Not because he stood for election in Tankerville on a principle that he's now reneging on, but because earlier in his career, he voted with his conscience. And Bonteen tells Gresham, never trust a politician who votes with his conscience. No one wants hidden depths in politics. No one wants to go behind the personality on the surface to find there's something else underneath. Those are the ones you can't trust. And Gresham agrees with him. He doesn't think that Phineas Finn is particularly trustworthy. And so Phineas Finn and Bonteen become bitter rivals. And Phineas Finn is stymied in his career by a person who hates his personality. And then it gets very melodramatic because they have a row in a club and Phineas Finn is so angry, he sort of says as he's leaving, God, I could bash that guy over the head. And then on Mr. Bonteen's walk home, he's murdered because someone does bash him over the head with the kind of object that Phineas Finn is known to carry around in his pocket to see off ruffians. And Finn was known to have quarrelled with him, to have been seen close to the scene of the murder, to have a motive. The evidence is all circumstantial, but it points to Phineas Finn. As I said earlier, it's not a murder mystery because Trollope intervenes as the narrator at this point and says, a better novelist than me might be able to create some suspense here, but I have to tell you up front, he didn't do it, the Jew did it. I'm not even going to tell you why the Jew did it. It has to do with bigamy. So we know he's an innocent man, but the circumstantial evidence looks bad. He's arrested. He's charged with the murder of Mr. Bonteen. He faces a trial, a jury trial of 12 of his peers. And we know he didn't do it, but it looks bad. And there is some jeopardy that he might hang. His friends, his really close friends, know he didn't do it, but there aren't many of those. His political friends have their doubts, including Mr. Gresham himself. So Phineas Finn is known to be a good chap, and good chaps don't commit murder. On the other hand, the circumstantial evidence looks bad, and he's flaky. He did row with this guy. The Prince of Wales was at the club when they had their row, so that doesn't look good. You wouldn't do that in front of the Prince of Wales unless you had lost your mind. And Phineas Finn becomes aware that though one or two people believe in his innocence, most people are hedging their bets, including most of his political friends, who say, well, we must let justice take its course. If you didn't do it, the British justice system will acquit you. And if the British justice system doesn't acquit you, even though we know probably in our heart of hearts that it's unlikely that you did it, you also will therefore have done it because we have to believe what the system tells us to believe. And that's the thing that sends Phineas Finn mad. He just about holds it together during the trial. But the fact that his so-called political friends are willing to trust in the system rather than try and actually uncover the truth, because we know what the truth is here. There is a hidden depth in this case. There is something behind the surface of this story. The surface is circumstantial evidence, but the truth is that he didn't do it. The Jew did it. And Finn can't bear that they don't seem to be interested in going beneath the surface of the process and the procedure and the formulaic version of justice to find actual justice, actual truth, that it causes him to have a breakdown. He holds himself together under the threat of being hanged, and he more or less says, I don't mind about being hanged. You have to take these hazards in life. What I can't bear is my political friends don't believe in me. And he loses faith in the system. He can't anymore believe in a system that's not willing to look behind the surface to try and find out the hidden truth. There are other dramas going on too at the same time. This is a book full of subplots, some of them really boring. There's a subplot about hunting and foxes and hounds and a wood that has a property dispute over it. There are love affairs in this book, including more than one, involving Phineas Finn, and it is one of the women who loves him who eventually finds the evidence that means that he gets acquitted. And when he is acquitted, he becomes the hero of the hour again. All his political friends rally round him and they say, oh, we knew you were innocent. Oh, we never doubted you for a moment. We had to let justice run its course. But my God, we never believed. We wouldn't have dreamt of letting you hang. But Finn knows they would have let him hang. And they don't believe it. He knows they're all hypocrites. He knows this is a world of hypocrisy. And in fact, even across all of these subplots, plots about marriage and property, the theme is consistent from parliamentary life to the relations between men and women, the relations between the sexes. This is an economy of hypocrisy. Everybody here is trading in double standards. There isn't a hidden truth. There's not a hidden truth in love anymore in politics, so that at a certain point, justice or love comes to the surface and sets things right. That does not happen in this world. When things reach the surface, they always have to be experienced as surface phenomena. You never get the true version of the superficial thing. You only ever get the superficial version of the true thing. There are lots of different points in the book, including in the relations between men and women, which are versions of parliamentary politics. This is a world where women do not have the vote, they do not have power, but Trollope wants us to believe that many women in high politics have power behind the throne, that many wives control their husbands, and many women are able to exercise power through influence, through a kind of bedroom politics. And some of the women in this book are portrayed as having real influence, the real ability to shape events, including the wife of the central character in the Palliser books as a whole, a man implausibly called Plantagenet Palliser, who is a chancellor, who is prime minister, who in the course of this book becomes a duke. His wife becomes a duchess. She's an influencer. She has a salon. She draws men into her orbit and then she plays them off against each other, including Mr. Gresham. He's a duke on the liberal side of politics. When she becomes a duchess, she is disappointed because she knows part of her influence depends on her ability to gossip, and duchesses aren't supposed to gossip. They become objects of reverence, and to do the kind of politics that she does, she needs to be not just an object of reverence, but an object of, among other things, desire. It's a complicated life she has to lead. But Trollope wants us to believe she does have power. And she believes she has power, real influence. And she believes in Phineas Finn. He's a friend of hers. And she's one of the people who knows he didn't do it. She absolutely knows he didn't do it. He's not capable of it. And so she summons her husband. She summons Mr. Gresham when she knows he's going to be prime minister. And she says to them, look, we do believe in the truth, don't we? And we know he didn't do it. Now, there is a danger that the criminal justice system won't see the truth, and it will actually find him guilty. And then if it finds him guilty, he will lose his life. And we all know this is intolerable. And we're all politicians here, so we know what we have to do. We've got to manipulate public opinion. We've got to manipulate the jury. She says to her husband, can't you leak to the press the story that he's really innocent? Can't you try and subvert this process in the way that you always subvert regular political processes? In politics, no one has any compunction about leaking things to the press. So why don't we do it in this case? And they say to her, we're not allowed to in this case because this is justice. And she says, come off it. It's not justice. None of this is justice. There is this thing called truth, and the truth is he didn't do it. And everything else is up for grabs. Everything else is just a game. And they explain to her, yes, but we can't admit it's a game. If we admit that it's just a game, if we are seen to be manipulating the justice system, if it's even suspected that we manipulate the justice system, no one will believe in us anymore. We're only believed in, they don't put it in quite such explicit terms, if we're hypocrites. We're only believed in if actually we keep up appearances. It doesn't matter whether he did it or not. The most important thing is that we allow due process to take its course. And that sends her mad. She can't bear that these politicians who, when it suits them, are totally willing to manipulate the system will also get on their high horse when they think that they might be exposed. One of the things that Trollope does in this book, one of the things that makes it so appealing, is he puts truth-telling in the mouths of characters who are completely not to be trusted. In this currency of hypocrisy, in this world of double standards, there isn't such a thing as the deceived and the undeceived, the sincere and the hypocrites. Everyone is more or less deceived and self-deceived, and everyone is playing a double game, which means that the truth often comes in the words from the mouth of the people who are the least to be relied on. The least reliable character in this book is a journalist called Quintus Slide, an awful editor of a paper that's a kind of Daily Mail. It's not a rag, it's not a gossip rag, it's a paper in its own mind of high principle. It's constantly producing thundering editorials about the need to uphold important conventional values of morality. It's entirely hypocritical because Quintus Slide will do whatever the people who are paying his wages want him to do. In this case, it's also driven by personal animus because he's another one who hates Phineas Finn. He's jealous of him. He's jealous of the glamour. He's jealous of the women in his life. He wants to destroy him. He spends a large part of the book trying to destroy him. He is absolutely cock-a-hoop when this man is charged with murder. He's convinced that he did it. He writes thundering editorials in favour of British justice, saying it's so wonderful that the British justice system will bring this murderer to justice and that he will hang. And then when Phineas Finn is acquitted, Quintus Slide is also sent mad. He can't bear it. But he's a journalist, he knows what he has to do, so he writes more thundering editorials in favour of British justice again and saying, isn't it wonderful that British justice arrives at the truth and wouldn't dare send an innocent man to the gallows? But he also says, but isn't it interesting that all it took was for this man to be acquitted of a crime that he didn't commit, and now people are talking about him as a future prime minister, because when Phineas Finn is acquitted in this book, everything moves his way. All of his enemies become his friends. Public opinion turns in his favour. He becomes the most popular politician in the country. People feel desperately sorry for him. They are so admiring of the dignity with which he held himself together under this terrible pressure, though we know behind the scenes that he was weeping and rending his garments. And they see this glittering career ahead of him. This is a man who must be whisked into the government. He must be given positions of authority. Phineas Finn, who is sick of politics, stands down from his seat, and his electors re-elect him anyway because they think it's so wonderful to be represented by this innocent man. And Quintus Slide writes an editorial in which he says, but that's not true, is it? It's not true that because you were accused of something you didn't do and then you were acquitted of that thing, you've suddenly gone from being someone who's not fit for office to being someone that we should think of as a future prime minister. You haven't become better at politics, more competent. You don't understand the questions better. Nothing about Phineas Finn's experiences actually mean that he should be lionized as the savior of the Liberal Party. Quintus Slide says this. Quintus Slide is not to be trusted on anything. Quintus Slide is motivated by bitterness and jealousy and personal animus. Quintus Slide will change his position depending on who pays him. And yet, what Quintus Slide says is true. It is true that Phineas Finn has not suddenly become the saviour of the Liberal Party just because he was accused of a crime he didn't commit. Public opinion is as fickle as Quintus Slide is, which is why he's so good at exploiting it. Parliamentary opinion is as fickle as Quintus Slide is. All of it is happening on the surface. There isn't a hidden truth here. Quintus Slide points out that the emperor has no clothes. Quintus Slide is right. It doesn't make any difference. And then the book ends with Phineas Finn having a crisis of conscience, another one. And Phineas Finn is an interesting character because he is portrayed by Trollope as a very glamorous, very attractive personality. It is partly Trollope fantasizing about a version of his own life. Trollope had spent time in Ireland. He wanted to be an MP, and there's a glamorous version of the parliamentary life which is projected through Phineas Finn. And you know Trollope would have loved it. It's an enviable life in many ways, but Phineas Finn is also really annoying. He's whiny. He has a gilded life, but he's always finding things that are wrong with it. As someone says of him, he's a terribly nice chap, but he is a Catholic. He doesn't have any money, and he will fall in love with women all the time, so he's not to be trusted. And it's kind of true, the last bit anyway. And yet he also keeps having these attacks of conscience. He keeps lurching between being a pragmatist and being a principled politician. And it gets annoying, and it gets quite whiny. And at the end, He can't bear it that his political friends didn't stick by him. He can't bear it that some of them thought he might have killed this man. And he washes his hands of the lot of them. And he says, I'm not going back to politics. I've seen through it. I've seen the hidden truth. The hidden truth is that it's all a show. It's all a sham. None of them have real principles. They don't stick by their friends. They'll do anything for power, and then they'll dress it up as principle. And he says, I just don't have the stomach for it anymore. I'm not doing it. And the woman that he ends up marrying, the woman in the end that he loves and who loves him, and actually is the woman who gets him acquitted, says to him, but Phineas, that now makes you a hypocrite, this latest attack of conscience, because before all this happened to you, you had completely reconciled yourself to this way of life. And you know that this way of life isn't one that should turn on the accidents that happen to people. And she says to him, think about what happened to you as an accident. Right? It's not some great morality tale. It's like someone falling down a well. It's like someone breaking their leg. If you saw a politician who understood how the game was played, and then an accident happened to him, and he suddenly said, it's all a sham, it's all a charade, you would think of that politician that he was a lightweight, that actually he was a hypocrite, that he had gone against his own principles, because his principles were, you have to play the game. And now he's saying, because I don't like this thing that's happened to me, because it hurt, because my leg is sore, I'm no longer willing to play the game. You would be disgusted by that politician. So come on, toughen up. You've got this world opened up for you now. It's just an accident. She doesn't say it, but she implies it. Quintus Slide was right. You don't deserve it any more than you deserved before to be accused of a murder you didn't commit. These things happen. But the difference is now everyone is your friend. Gresham is about to offer you a position in his government, which he does. He's going to make you a minister. You're going to have money. I'm going to marry you. I'm rich. You're going to be rich. You might be prime minister one day. All you have to do is not swallow your principles, but remember your principles, because your principles are an understanding that this is a world of surface events. And what happened to you was not some great revelation. It was just another surface event. And he doesn't listen to her. And he doesn't take the post in the government. And he says no to Gresham. He can't stomach it. He can't bear it. He's seen through it. It's all a sham. And he's going to live a life of some kind of principle. She marries him anyway. She forgives him. She says she understands him. Love conquers whatever feelings she had about the fact that she just told him it would make him a hypocrite. She can reconcile herself to the hypocrisy of Phineas Finn because she loves him. Not because love conquers all, because in this version of life, and it's not a caricature of life, it's not a satire of life, Trollope is describing a world that I think he thinks is being described truthfully, because the truth is on the surface. In this version of life, it's not that love conquers all because that's the truth. It's simply that love conquers all is one of the stories that we tell ourselves to reconcile ourselves to the fact that there is no hidden truth. And in this case, it ends happily ever after for Phineas Finn and for the woman who becomes his wife. Because the woman who becomes his wife, who is wiser than he is, knows that in the end, love is on the surface too, and we all have to make our peace with the fact that no one can ever be completely true to him or herself, and everyone has to make do with a world in which principles only have force on the surface of things. If you're enjoying this series about the great political fictions and you would like to get more of it, and also you would like to support this podcast to keep us going and growing, do please become a subscriber to PPF Plus. Just go to ppfideas.com or click on the link that comes with the show description. The next book I'm going to be talking about in this series is another one that might sound like it's not really about politics. It's also a book that I think a lot of people think they know well. It's Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I thought I knew it well. I thought maybe it wasn't about politics. It's about all sorts of things you just can't imagine. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.